The mashed potatoes had gone cold on my plate, but I barely noticed. My mother's voice cut through the dining room like a blade, sharp and unforgiving. "Sarah, honestly, when are you going to get your act together?" Mom's fork clinked against her plate as she gestured dismissively in my direction. 28 years old and still working at that little bookstore. Your sister Jennifer has a real career, a real future. I kept my eyes down, focusing on the pattern in the tablecloth that I'd memorized from countless family dinners just like this one. The same floral design I'd stared at as a child when Dad would lecture me about my grades, the same threads I'd traced with my finger during high school when nothing I did seemed good enough. "The bookstore's doing well, Mom," I said quietly, though I knew it would fall on deaf ears. "Well," Dad chimed in, setting down his wine glass with more force than necessary. "Sarah, that's not a career. That's a hobby that pays minimum wage. Look at Jennifer. She just got promoted to senior marketing director. She has a house, a husband, a plan." Jennifer, sitting across from me, had the grace to look uncomfortable, but she didn't say anything. She never did. Golden child syndrome was a hard habit to break, even at 32. "I mean, what do you even do all day?" Mom continued, warming to her favorite topic. "Dust books? Read romance novels? It's embarrassing when people ask me what my youngest daughter does for a living." My hands tightened around my fork. If only she knew what I'd been doing for the past 2 years. If only she had any idea about the sleepless nights, the second mortgage on my tiny apartment, the freelance editing work I'd been doing until 3 a.m. just to make ends meet. Not for my ends, but for theirs. "Sarah needs to face reality," Dad said, cutting into his steak with surgical precision. "The world doesn't owe you a living just because you like books. Maybe it's time to consider going back to school, getting a business degree, something practical." "Or maybe," Mom added with a laugh that had no warmth in it, "she could move back home until she figures it out." Though, honestly, I'm not sure there's much hope at this point. Some people are just, well, they're just not cut out for success. The word failure hung in the air unspoken, but we all heard it. I looked around the dining room, the same dining room where I'd helped Dad refinish the hardwood floors when I was 16, where Mom had taught me to fold napkins for dinner parties, where we'd celebrated every birthday and holiday for decades. The crystal chandelier overhead caught the light from the candles, casting familiar shadows on walls lined with family photos. Photos that told a different story than the one my parents were spinning tonight. There I was at my college graduation, summa cum laude in English literature. There was the picture from when I'd won the state writing competition in high school. The photo of me at the bookstore's grand reopening last year, beaming as I cut the ribbon, the local newspaper photographer capturing what had been one of the proudest moments of my life. But none of that mattered now. Not when they were looking at me like I was a disappointment, a burden, a failure. "You know what your problem is, Sarah?" Mom leaned forward, her voice taking on that particular tone that meant she was about to deliver what she considered a profound truth. "You've never had to struggle for anything. You've never learned what real responsibility looks like. You live in that cute little apartment, working your cute little job, but you've never had to make the hard choices adults make." I almost laughed. Almost. Because if she only knew about the choice I'd made 22 months ago when their accountant had called me, desperate and apologetic. "I'm sorry to bother you, Sarah," Mr. Henderson had said, his voice strained over the phone. "But your parents, they're in serious trouble. The restaurant investments, the market crash, the medical bills from your father's surgery, they're going to lose the house. I've been trying to work with the bank, but..." I'd been at the bookstore when the call came, reorganizing the children's section, completely oblivious to the financial disaster that had been building in my parents' lives. They'd hidden it well, still driving their luxury cars, still hosting dinner parties, still maintaining the facade of success that had always been so important to them. How much? I'd asked, already doing mental calculations of my savings, my credit options, the possibilities I might have. $61,000. That's what they need to bring the mortgage current and pay off the immediate debts. Without it, foreclosure proceedings start next month. $61,000. I'd had $8,000 in savings. But I'd figured it out. The second mortgage on my apartment that I'd bought with my grandmother's inheritance. The freelance editing work that kept me up until the early hours of the morning. The careful budgeting that meant I hadn't bought new clothes in over a year, hadn't taken a vacation, hadn't even gone out to dinner unless it was someone else's treat. I'd figured it out because they were my parents, and despite everything, I loved them. Despite the constant criticism, the way they dismissed my dreams, the way they made me feel small at every family gathering, I loved them. And I'd made Mr. Henderson promise not to tell them where the money came from. I'd wanted them to think they'd gotten a loan modification, a lucky break, anything but the truth. I hadn't wanted their gratitude or their guilt. I just wanted them to keep their home. "Earth to Sarah," Jennifer said, snapping me back to the present. "Mom asked you a question." "I asked what your 5-year plan is," Mom repeated with exaggerated patience. "Though I suppose expecting you to think that far ahead might be unrealistic." Dad chuckled, and the sound felt like fingernails on a chalkboard. "You know what, Mom?" I set down my fork and looked directly at her for the first time all evening. "You want to talk about responsibility? About making hard choices?" "Oh, here we go," Dad muttered, rolling his eyes. "More excuses." "You want to talk about facing reality?" I continued, my voice getting stronger. "About what real adults do when people they love are in trouble?" "Sarah, what are you—" Jennifer started, but I held up a hand. "Do you know what I've been doing for the past 22 months while you've been calling me irresponsible?" I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. "Do you have any idea what your failure of a daughter has been up to?" Mom's face had taken on that pinched expression she got when she thought I was about to embarrass myself. "Sweetie, maybe you should—" $61,000, I said clearly, watching their faces change. "That's how much I've paid to keep this house from going into foreclosure." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed to pause. "What are you talking about?" Dad's voice was barely a whisper. 22 months ago, Mr. Henderson called me. Did you know he had my number? Apparently, he'd been trying to reach you both for weeks about the financial situation, but you kept putting him off, so he called me. I walked to the window, looking out at the garden Mom had spent decades perfecting. He told me about the restaurant investments that went bad, about the medical bills from Dad's surgery that insurance didn't cover, about how you'd been robbing Peter to pay Paul for months, and how you were 8 weeks away from losing this house. That's impossible," Mom stammered. "We worked something out with the bank." "We got a loan modification." "No," I said, turning back to face them. "You got a daughter who took out a second mortgage on her apartment. A daughter who's been working freelance editing jobs until 3 in the morning, every single night, for almost 2 years. A daughter who hasn't bought herself anything that wasn't absolutely necessary because every extra penny went to keeping your house." Jennifer's hand had flown to her mouth. Dad had gone completely pale. "The cute little bookstore you love to mock? I bought it with my grandmother's inheritance because it was profitable and I needed the income to cover your mortgage payments. Those romance novels you think I spend all day reading? I've been editing them for publishing companies at $50 an hour to keep the lights on in this house. Sarah," Mom's voice was small now, nothing like the commanding tone from moments before. Why didn't you tell us? Because I knew exactly what would happen. You would have felt guilty, and then you would have found a way to make it my fault. You would have said I was being dramatic, or that you didn't ask for my help, or that I was trying to make you feel bad. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Just like you're going to do now. We wouldn't. Dad tried, but the words died on his lips. Wouldn't you? I pulled out my phone and scrolled to my banking app. Want to see the receipts? The payments to Morrison and Associates Mortgage Services? $61,000, paid in installments over 22 months. Account holder, Sarah Elizabeth Morrison. Your failure of a daughter. I set the phone on the table, the screen showing the detailed payment history. Transaction after transaction, each one representing another sleepless night, another weekend spent editing manuscripts instead of living my life, another month of choosing between groceries and savings. Mom reached for the phone with shaking hands, scrolling through the payments. Her face crumpled as the reality sank in. Oh my God, Jennifer whispered. Sarah, I had no idea. None of us had any idea. Of course you didn't, I said, my voice steady despite the emotions churning inside me. Because you were all too busy telling me what a disappointment I was to actually pay attention to what I was doing. But why? Dad asked, his voice breaking. After everything why would you do this for us? Because you're my parents, I said simply. Because I love you. Because the thought of you losing this house, losing everything you'd worked for, was unbearable to me. Even when you made me feel like I was worth nothing, I couldn't stand the idea of you being hurt. The tears were flowing freely down Mom's face now. Sarah, I'm so sorry. We're so sorry. We didn't know. That's just it, Mom. You didn't want to know. It was easier to see me as the family disappointment than to consider that maybe, just maybe, I was doing something meaningful with my life. It was easier to compare me to Jennifer than to actually ask me what was going on in my world. I walked back to my chair but didn't sit down. Do you know what the worst part is? I was proud of what I'd done. I'd saved your house. I'd kept your family together. I'd made sacrifices that mattered. But every time I came to dinner, every time we talked on the phone, all I heard was how I was wasting my life. We were wrong, Dad said, tears in his eyes now too. We were so wrong, sweetheart. Can you ever forgive us? I looked around the room again, at the faces of my family, all changed now, all seeing me differently than they had an hour ago. The power dynamic had shifted completely, but I found that I didn't want to savor their guilt or make them grovel. I was just tired. I don't know, I said honestly. I need time to think. I need time to figure out who I am when I'm not trying to prove my worth to people who refuse to see it. What does that mean? Jennifer asked, though her voice suggested she was afraid of the answer. It means I'm done with dinners like this one. I'm done being your punching bag, your cautionary tale, your example of what not to do with your life. Picked up my purse from the side table. I'm done pretending that this is normal, that families are supposed to make each other feel worthless. Sarah, please don't go, Mom pleaded. We can talk about this. We can fix this. Can we? I paused at the dining room doorway. Because 5 minutes ago, you were ready to write me off as a hopeless failure. Now that you know I've been financially supporting you for almost 2 years, suddenly I'm worth listening to? The question hung in the air, unanswered because we all knew the truth. I love you all, I said finally. But I need to love myself too, and I can't do that in a family that only values me when they need something from me. I walked out of that house for what I knew might be the last time as the same person who'd walked in. The evening air was crisp against my face, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe fully. My phone started buzzing before I even reached my car. Text after text, call after call. Jennifer apologizing, Mom crying, Dad trying to explain. I turned off the sound and drove home in blessed silence. That night, for the first time in 22 months, I didn't open my laptop to edit manuscripts until the early hours of the morning. Instead, I sat in my small apartment, my apartment that I'd nearly lost trying to save their house, and I wrote. I wrote about a daughter who loved her family more than they loved her. I wrote about sacrifice and recognition, about the weight of being invisible and the cost of being seen. I wrote until my fingers cramped and my eyes burned, purging years of hurt and frustration and love and disappointment onto the pages. 3 weeks later, that story became my first published piece in a major literary magazine. The payment wasn't much, but it was mine, earned from my words, my experience, my truth. 6 months after that dinner, I received a letter from a small press interested in my work. They'd read the magazine piece and wanted to know if I had more stories, maybe enough for a collection. I did. I had years' worth of stories about family and expectations, about finding yourself when everyone else has decided who you should be, about the courage it takes to walk away from people you love when loving them is destroying you. The book deal wasn't huge, but it was real. More importantly, it was recognition for who I actually was, not who my family thought I should be. Mom and Dad tried to reach out several times over those months. They wanted to pay me back, they said. They wanted to make amends. They wanted to have dinner and start over. But I learned something in those quiet months after I stopped trying to earn their approval. You can't start over with people who've never actually seen you in the first place. Jennifer was different. She came to the bookstore one afternoon, 6 months after that dinner, looking nervous and uncertain. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began, fidgeting with her wedding ring, "about how we never actually asked what was going on in your world." I looked up from the inventory I'd been working on, and I realized you were right. I don't know anything about your life. I don't know about your dreams, your goals, what makes you happy, what keeps you up at night, well, besides the editing work, which I had no idea about. She paused, seeming to gather courage. "So I'm asking now. What's going on in your world, Sarah?" It was a small question, but it was the first time anyone in my family had asked it without judgment, without an agenda, without already having decided what my answer should be. So I told her. I told her about the bookstore's community reading programs, about the local authors I'd been mentoring, about my writing, about the book deal, about the life I'd been building while they were all busy deciding it wasn't good enough. She listened, really listened, for the first time in years. "I'm proud of you," she said when I finished. "I should have said that years ago, but I'm saying it now. I'm proud of who you are and what you've accomplished. It wasn't everything. It didn't erase the years of feeling invisible and dismissed. But it was something, a crack in the wall of misunderstanding that had separated us for so long. As for Mom and Dad, they eventually stopped calling quite so frequently. The money they'd insisted they wanted to pay back remained in their accounts. I told Mr. Henderson to make it clear that I considered it a gift, not a loan. They didn't owe me anything except the respect I'd been asking for all along. A year after that dinner, my story collection was published by a small but well-regarded press. The launch event was held at my bookstore, packed with local readers, other writers, and people who'd supported my work without ever needing to be convinced of its worth. Jennifer came. She brought flowers and stayed for the entire reading, clapping louder than anyone when I finished. Mom and Dad didn't come. I'd sent them an invitation, but I hadn't expected them to show up. They were still too raw, too confused about how to relate to this version of their daughter. the one who'd found her voice and wasn't afraid to use it. But that was okay. For the first time in my life, their approval wasn't necessary for me to feel successful. Their presence wasn't required for the evening to be perfect. As I signed books and talked with readers about the stories born from that terrible dinner and the months of reflection that followed, I realized something profound had shifted. The girl who'd sat silently while her parents called her a failure was gone. In her place was a woman who knew her own worth, who understood that love shouldn't require you to diminish yourself, who had learned the difference between family that lifts you up and family that tears you down. The last story in my collection was titled The Dinner Party. It ended with a woman walking out of her childhood home and into a life she'd built for herself, leaving behind people who loved their idea of who she should be more than who she actually was. Some reviewers called it harsh, others called it honest. I called it necessary, because sometimes the greatest act of love, for others and for yourself, is refusing to accept being treated as less than you are. Sometimes the most profound victory isn't proving them wrong about who you are, but proving to yourself